Great.
Is it?
Testing.
Great. Is it?
Kayla, are we ready to go? Are we recording? That's a thumbs up? Yes. Great. We'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Ken Prude. I'm the Sustainability Director for this lovely town. And welcome tonight. Thanks so much for being here. This event here tonight at the Jenks Center will be a panel discussion with Senator Jason Lewis, Rep. Mike Day, and Rep. Michelle Socolo. Thanks so much for being here tonight. And unfortunately, Senator Pat Jalen really wanted to be here. She could not come because she has come down with COVID. And she is symptomatic, so she is at home and wishing us the best. The topic of tonight's panel is recent and upcoming state climate change legislation. That might sound a little boring, except that the legislation passed in this state in the last session and this session is actually very exciting, and you're going to hear about that tonight. Tonight's event is part of Winchester Climate Solutions Week, a series of 20 events that are running through this Sunday, October 2nd. A full list of events is on the table back there. I think many of you picked it up. It's also available on our website, winchester.us. Just scroll to the bottom of the page and you'll see a featured ad for the events. I want to thank the Jenks Center for hosting us tonight, WinCam for live streaming and recording tonight's event, Town Manager Beth Rudolph and Select Board Chair Rich Mucci, who will offer introductory remarks, our panelists for accepting the invitation to participate tonight, members of the Select Board and Climate Action Advisory Committee for being here tonight and for their support, Tatiana Chapon-Mays for assisting me with collecting questions from the audience. That's her right there. You met her on the way in. And all of you for taking time out of your evenings to be with us here tonight. And here's how the event will go, just so you can have a sense of what's coming. The town manager and select board chair will each make short introductory remarks. I will ask a couple of big questions of the panel and give them an opportunity to respond. During this time, fill out any questions you have on the card that you picked up at the front. If you don't have an index card and a pencil to write down your questions, you can circle back to that table, pick it up, fill out your questions. Tatiana will get those from you and bring them here to me at the table. We're not going to have live Q&A. It's all going to be through the index cards. I'm sorry, but that's just how we're doing it. And that's it. We'll now hear from Beth Rudolph, our town manager. I don't know if you want to hold this, or I'll just put it right here for now. You can take it from there. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Very happy to be here this evening. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the Jenks Center for hosting us in this wonderful facility. First, I want to start by thanking our Sustainability Director, Ken Pruitt, for his work over the past few months to organize the town's first annual, and I'm calling it annual event, and maybe Ken will, hopefully Ken will feel that way also after he's completed this week. So our first annual Climate Solutions Week, which has events running through this Sunday. So far, it's been a week filled with a lot of great programs and educational opportunities for our residents, and tonight's panel discussion is no different. So thank you to the panel for joining us. Winchester adopted our first climate action plan in 2011, and we completed a plan update in 2020 through the leadership of our select board and the Climate Action Plan Committee, which was tasked with that update. The plan provides the town with a roadmap to reach the stated climate goals of reducing carbon pollution, including a commitment by the town to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by the year 2050, and to increase our community's resilience. Attaining these goals will require dedication and effort on all of our parts. At a local level, that includes thinking about future investments in our municipal infrastructure, buildings, and transportation network through the lens of being part of a climate solution. I'm looking forward to hearing more this evening from our state senator and representatives about recent and upcoming climate legislation and at the state level, and understanding how we can adapt that to our work here in Winchester. So with that, I'll turn it over to the chair of our select board, Mr. Richard Mucci. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'll be very brief. I want to welcome you all to this fantastic event. Thank you, Ken, for planning a wonderful week of events. It's been fantastic to see all the people attend and all the great information that's been being provided. Don't forget about the jean repair workshop tomorrow night. If you've got any holes in your jeans, that sounds like something I could use. We're lucky in this town to have tremendous citizen participation in issues such as climate change and all our policies that we're trying to better the community with. We're also very lucky to have a great staff that I get to see the inner workings of on a daily basis, including Ken and Beth under her leadership. If you're following the select board at all, and I hope you're not, but if you are, we just had a substantive discussion about the HVAC system at the town hall, and an all-electric system was decided to be put in. We have our Lynch School project going on right now, which is involving substantial discussions about the sustainability portions of that project. It's very humbling and proud to see our community come together and understand what we need to do to be good citizens with these types of projects. So it's great to be a part of it, and it's great to watch all these great people do that work. So we're very lucky in that sense. We're also very lucky to have a legislative delegation that we do. They're very committed to these issues. They're really the leaders that I feel in the state on these issues. So it's my pleasure to introduce them tonight. We have Senator Jason Lewis and Representative Michael Day, who most people know in this area. I'm not going to go through their bios. You've probably heard it at least 100 times. So, but we're very fortunate to have both of them. I do want to welcome Michelle Sicolo tonight, who some of you may not know very well, but she is our representative that represents the 6th precinct, my precinct, in Winchester. I don't know what I said to Rep. Day, but I must have said something to be axed. Just a little bit about Representative Sicolo. She represents the 15th Middlesex District, consisting of Lexington, parts of Woburn, and Precinct 6 in Winchester. She serves on the following committees: the Joint Committee on Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities, Joint Committee on Elder Affairs, Joint Committee on Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture, Joint Committee on State Administration and Regulatory Oversight. She is co-chair with Senator Lewis of the Zero Waste Caucus, and she's a Lexington resident. So I want to extend a very warm welcome to her this evening, and I look forward to hearing all three of you give us an update on what's going on at the state level. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to kick this off by talking about the game-changing legislation passed by the legislature in 2021 and 2022. Before 2021, the last significant climate legislation was in 2008, the Global Warming Solutions Act. It took 13 years before the next major climate bill was passed in the legislature. And that was the 2021 Act, creating a next-generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy. Many of us were worried that it would take another decade or more before the legislature passed another major climate bill. But lo and behold, 1 year later, this year in 2022, an act driving clean energy and offshore wind was also passed by the legislature with similarly groundbreaking, game-changing implications. So I have a three-part question for each of you. I'll ask all three parts, and then you can take it from there. What stands out to you from these two bills? What's really important? Do you think the major takeaways? How did we get two major climate bills 2 years in a row after 13 years of drought? And finally, should we expect major climate bills every year going forward, or at least every session? Hopefully the answer is yes. And I'll leave it with there. Senator Lewis, do you want to start off?
Sure. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I also want to thank Ken Pruitt for your tremendous work as the town's new sustainability director and putting together this first ever Climate Solutions Week. And thank you to everybody who's been involved in organizing the weeks and running the week's events. It's really great to see Winchester again being a leader regionally and even statewide on combating climate change and advancing sustainability. I'm also delighted to share the stage with my colleagues. Obviously, we know Rep. Day very well, but I also want to extend a very warm welcome to Representative Sicolo. We actually got to know each other before she was a state representative, and And since she's been in the legislature, we co-founded the Zero Waste Caucus together, which is very relevant for tonight's discussion. Representative Sokolo is a champion in our state legislature on many issues, but particularly environmental issues. So she's going to be a tremendous addition to the Winchester legislative delegation. And again, I'm sorry that Senator Jalen sends her regrets. So let me start out by saying that Massachusetts and the Northeast in general has been identified as one of the most vulnerable areas to the impacts of climate change. That's for some pretty obvious reasons. We have a pretty lengthy coastline. We're very densely populated. And we've been around a long time. We've got lots of old, aging, crumbling infrastructure, whether that's our housing or our transit and so forth. So it's particularly important, and of course you wouldn't be here tonight if you all didn't already believe this, but important to continue to get this message out there that we are leaders nationally and globally in addressing climate change and in accelerating the transition to a clean energy, a green economy. And what I would say on the positive note is that fortunately, really taking strong actions and in some cases quite bold actions to combat climate change and make our communities, our state more sustainable has generally been a bipartisan goal in our state, and it's been an imperative that's been broadly shared by political leaders, business leaders, and many others as well. So I draw a lot of hope from that and optimism, because as we know in some other parts of the country, this is not you cannot say that at all, but that is fortunately is the case here, and I have great confidence, and assuming Maura Healey is our next governor, that will very much continue to be the case. So as Ken said, two very significant climate and clean energy bills were debated and passed by the state legislature and ultimately signed into law by Governor Baker. Actually, it's not as bleak a picture as Ken said in terms of that desert, if you will, because these two bills basically have been worked on for at least 4 years, maybe 5 years. In the state legislature. And big shout out, by the way, to my colleague, Senator Mike Barrett from Lexington, who's been a real leader on these. And there's been some terrific leaders in the House, and you guys will talk about them. But the bill that passed in the beginning of 2021, which is known as the Next Generation Roadmap for Mass Climate Policy, that was actually a bill the state legislature passed the previous legislative session, and we worked on it for 2 years to get there. Unfortunately, it took a little longer to get Governor Baker on board, notwithstanding my comments about bipartisan agreement. But we got him there, and we signed it into law. And there's a lot in both of these bills, and we're not going to go through all the details. But the highlight of that bill is basically establishing a net zero goal for emissions for Massachusetts by 2050. And it sets interim targets that we have to meet, and it requires detailed plans to be developed, across all sectors, state government, to meet those targets. So that's clearly one of the highlights of that bill. One other big thing in that bill that I do want to mention that often doesn't come up in these conversations is environmental justice. That was not something that we really talked about that much in our work in environmental work in years past. But it's become much more front and center of our conversations about sustainability, environmental policy, and climate policy. And I'm really glad that is the case. And what we're talking about there, for those who are not that familiar, is the disproportionate impact that climate change and pollution and other environmental issues have on marginalized communities. And these very often tend to be communities with lower income folks, often communities of color, and those are the communities where we put incinerators, where we have landfills that are much more at risk of the impacts of heat islands, flooding, and so on. In that bill from the Next Generation Roadmap, we explicitly write environmental justice, into our laws, and there's procedures and steps that need to be taken to account for environmental justice. Included in that bill also, I was very pleased, was a bill that I filed that basically mirrors California's standards for appliances for both energy efficiency and water efficiency. So we included that bill as part of the larger bill, and so that means that our appliance standards are going to be really at that gold standard of where California sets theirs. So did want to quickly mention that. The bill that was more recent, the Act Driving Clean Energy and Offshore Wind, I won't get into more details on that because I don't want to take too much time, but my colleagues I'm sure will mention highlights. I did want to mention a few other quick things. The Public Lands Preservation Act, which Ken has probably reached out to me on more times than I can probably count, which deals with the protection of open space land in the Commonwealth. That bill has passed both the House and Senate this session and is currently in a conference committee, which means that there's some differences that are being negotiated. I am confident that we will get to a final bill and get that to the governor's desk before the end of this year, which is the end of the legislative session. So that should be another big win for the environment this session. Also on the governor's desk right now is another bill that I filed together with Representative Brad Jones and Representative Rich Haggerty, which is a bill to expand access to the Green Communities Program. Winchester was one of the early adopters of the Green Communities Program. It's been enormously successful. But communities that are served by MLPs, which are municipal light plants, and I happen to represent two of them, Reading and Wakefield, have generally not joined the Green Communities Program. This bill is going to, hopefully the governor will sign it any day now, will help to make it easier for those communities to become part of the Green Communities Program. And again, more communities that are going to be doing the kinds of things Winchester's been doing in terms of energy efficiency projects, adopting clean and renewable energy, and so forth. There also have been hundreds of millions of dollars of both state money and federal pandemic relief dollars that the state has received that we have appropriated for climate adaptation, mitigation, and resiliency projects. And obviously, some of that started to go out to communities, but that's going to be happening over the next few years. And a good example of that is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, the MVP program, which Winchester is part of, and it's been a very successful program, again, where the state helps municipalities to undertake projects that make us more resilient to climate change. Two local projects that Rep. Day and I spent countless hours working on really over the last decade, which are related to this conversation tonight that I'm very proud of. The Tri-Community Greenway, which we finally got completed and has been very successful and much enjoyed by residents of Winchester, and obviously provides an alternative mode of transportation. And the other project, which is underway now, which I'm sure you're well aware of, is rebuilding a new Winchester Center commuter rail station. And that's also very exciting because it's going to give us a world-class train station in the downtown, and it's going to help to hopefully take even more cars off the road as more people hopefully will rely on public transit. So I'll wrap it up there. I know Representative Sokola, I'm sure, will talk about the work we're doing in the Zero Waste Caucus. We've got very exciting work that we're doing, and Representative Sokola was her idea to actually found the caucus, and she asked me to team with her, and I was very happy to do that. I think we've made a lot of progress even in our first session of advancing policies to reduce solid waste, things like single-use plastics, but I'll leave it to you to talk about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Who would like to go next?
I'll hop in, thanks. It's great to see everyone here. Great to see a lot of very familiar faces for the first time in a long time, but also better to see a lot of new faces here for these types of discussions. I'm Mike Day, the state rep for Stoneham and 7/8 of Winchester. We got too popular, so they had to split us up a little bit in there, but thrilled to welcome Michelle to the delegation as well. We've worked closely together over the last 2 terms, and a terrific addition to the Winchester legislation, so we grow richer by addition there. Ken, I'd take an issue, I guess, a little bit with the characterization of that desert that Jason referred to earlier. I think, my first term in office, we passed the Act to Promote Energy Diversity. And though not nominally a climate bill, it is a climate bill. And I think every piece of legislation coming out of the House and the Senate that gets to the governor's desk is a climate bill at this stage. So to your questions earlier of how did we get here and how did these two omnibus bills come, and I'll concede that we haven't had the omnibus bills before. You've got a change in outlook, I think, from the legislature itself, and that's because of a change in leadership, as well as a change in the composition of the body itself. And you've got individuals in there now, legislators and incoming legislators in particular now, and climate is on the forefront of their thought process. So every bill, as I say, is a climate bill. I chair Judiciary in the House right now, and we've got bills that touch on climate, even though we're supposed to be looking at criminal justice bills. Senator Lewis had referenced the environmental justice communities. That's coming right to us. So the prism we're looking at, and I think I know I speak for my colleagues here, but I think I speak for the majority of the legislature as well, is everything's got to have an impact on climate. So you've got to have that consideration on every piece of legislation that moves. So to your point, your question of, are we going to have this every year? Yeah. Just about every bill that comes through is going to have, hopefully, a positive impact on what we're doing with the climate itself. I would expect this to be an annual or a biannual omnibus piece of legislation moving through. We always tackle healthcare, because we can't get pricing and coverage and everything done yet. It's a never-ending job. Climate is in that same line. The legislature and hopefully the new governor is going to be putting that foremost. So yes, I think every session will be coming out with a comprehensive piece, because the work obviously never ends on that end. So I think that our climate policy work, at least in the House and the Senate, has been a multifaceted approach. We're not putting all of our chips in on one area. All right, so we're looking at response, prevention, and resiliency efforts throughout every bit of legislation that comes through. I think you see that in the last two omnibus pieces that we did pass. On this most recent one, again, we're not all in on wind. We're not all in on solar. We're taking the approach that you need to have a variety of pieces coming in, certainly on your renewable energy portfolio, to move it away from dirty fuel. And we are, I think, based on this last act that we passed at the last minute of our formal legislative session, now at the forefront in the country on wind, on what we're going to be doing there. You always hear that Massachusetts is the Saudi Arabia of wind. That's the kind of line that gets beaten into the ground. We're finally able to start realizing that. And I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Michelle, but I believe what they said was the United States set a target for wind generation and wind power. And Massachusetts alone is going to be able to meet, I believe, a third of that target once we get our industry up and moving. And the bill we just passed combines a variety of incentives as well as direct investments into the wind industry to make sure that we realize that and accelerate our move away from reliance on dirty energy. So I don't know if I answered the questions themselves. I know we're going to have a more fulsome discussion about that, but that's kind of the table setter that we look at moving forward here.
Great, thank you, Rep. Day and Rep. Sokolow.
Thank you. It's great to be here. This is probably my first public event in person in Winchester, so I'm really thrilled that it is focused on climate, since this is such a top priority for me. When I came into the legislature, I would have said that my priorities for my district were education and climate, and clearly within a very short period of time, it became evident that climate and environmental issues were even top of mind above education in my district, which is remarkable because Lexington is the predominantly large community in my district, and you all know that education is a value that you share as well here in Winchester. But I think that one of the reasons why we're doing more, yeah, it's absolutely to do with leadership in the House and the Senate, but it's also due to the advocacy, the amount of effort in communicating, in being responsive, in sending those emails, those messages and letters to us has gone up tenfold. And prior to being in the legislature, I was on the select board in Lexington and on the planning board. And each time I went through a major campaign for those roles, and the issues that people would talk to me about changed. And it's very clear that in the more recent campaigns, people were focusing on climate change, and they're aware that it's an existential threat. So it was wonderful for me to be part of these two major pieces of legislation and to see how transformative these efforts are going to be. And I think they are going to be transformative because they focus on what matters and through the lens of understanding that emissions are coming primarily 30% from our buildings, 30% from the grid, and about 40% from the transportation sector. And when you understand that, you can target programs and incentives to specifically advance what needs to be changed. So there's EV incentives, and there's incentives for solar, and Rep. Day spoke a little bit about the wind energy, which is going to be incredibly important for our economy. The job creation that's going to come from building the offshore wind will make sure that Massachusetts' economy stays strong for decades to come. And we are going to be not just a national leader in wind, but an international leader. So that's extremely exciting. Some of the things in the bill, the second bill that I was particularly interested in and followed very closely and involved in was the 10-community pilot. Lexington was one of the communities that petitioned through a home rule petition to be able to have a bylaw that would have restricted fossil fuels in new construction, actually prohibited fossil fuels in all new construction except for biotech buildings and except with small waivers for things like gas generators and stoves. And that bylaw wasn't able to go through because there was a lot of opposition to it from a number of corners of the state. But in this particular piece of legislation, we did retain the opportunity for 10 communities to pilot what will need to be the types of buildings we're going to build going forward. And I think that's extremely important because, as my other constituents in Lexington would say, it doesn't make sense to build a building that would have to be retrofitted based, potentially on the taxpayer's dime with tax incentives and credits to retrofit it later. Why not build it right now correctly from the get-go? And so that's something that needs to be watched carefully because we now see that Boston is interested in being one of those communities that is involved in the pilot. Just last week, the Stretch Energy Code came out. I think it was on Friday, and that is something that we've been working very closely with to make sure that there's a net zero option for our new construction buildings. And many people feel that that did not go far enough in the new Stretch Energy Code. So that is something where those communities, and Winchester is one that's a green community, have the option of participating in the Stretch Energy Code that's being proposed, the new one, and advocacy around improving what was adopted at the state level, I think, could be very important and very helpful. Also in this bill is an increase to the green communities funding, so the minimum project size goes up to $300,000, up from $100,000, which I think will also be helpful to communities trying to advance their specific projects. There's a ton of transportation-related incentives. I think I've mentioned some of them. And as Rep. Day said, every bill going forward is a climate bill, even our most recent transportation bond bill. I'm going to highlight that because the title, ironically, is an act relative to Massachusetts transportation resources and climate. And a big portion of what we were looking at in that bill was funding to help transform the transportation system. Keeping in mind that 42% of emissions come from transportation, we really need to focus many of our efforts there since it's very difficult to build infrastructure. We all know that we have a bit of a crisis on our hands right now with the MBTA and our transportation system, so a little bit more attention needs to be paid there. Relative to the Zero Waste Caucus, it's a terrific group of people. We have almost 60 legislators, I think, bipartisan, bicameral, and we had 3 priority bills last session that did better than they had ever done before. They didn't get across the finish line, but Chair Roy, who chairs our Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee, is very committed to seeing action on these bills next session. And the good news is, all of the bills that were our priorities were reported out favorably in some form. So Rep. Lewis and I had a plastics omnibus bill which covered single-use plastics. One of the reasons I'm very passionate about addressing the waste issue is because most of our facilities for incineration and landfills are in or adjacent to environmental justice communities. 6 out of 7 of the incinerators are in or adjacent to EJ communities. So it's an important thing to keep in mind that as we incinerate our waste instead of recycling or reducing the waste, it's harming some of our most vulnerable people in the Commonwealth. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really digging in on waste-related issues. And the other two bills that were the caucus priorities is the EPR bill by our Rep Day here, our very own. Fantastic extended producer responsibility bill, which he can talk about later since he knows more about it than any of us. And then the other bill was an increase and modification to the bottle bill, which hadn't been reported out favorably in 5 sessions or more. It's been at least a decade, I think, since there's been any positive movement on improving the bottle bill, expanding it to containers that we don't currently include in the bottle bill. And that's really important because most of the actual recycling that gets recycled into new bottle content, and as opposed to downcycled, is coming from the cleaner stream that is collected by the bottle bill collection system. Other curbside programs actually get downcycled because they get contaminated and commingled with plastics that can't be used again for food grade things. So we all got used to loving our curbside, barrel and throwing things in there, but the bottle bill program is actually a more effective way at doing recycling. So I'm looking forward to your questions about the 2 bills in particular. I've got good bill summaries here, and I could rattle on for hours about what's in them, but I think it'll be more interesting if folks get to ask their questions directly.
Great, thanks to all 3 of you. Just a note, first of all, very hopeful to hear everything you had to say. New leadership, a new commitment on behalf of everyone in the legislature, and climate bills coming out every year. It's all music to our ears, so thank you for that. You
missed one thing that was said, though, also is important to this, was the growing advocacy. Right, on the part of residents and environmental groups, and because I see a number of people in the room who have been active on these for years and years and years, and I know sometimes it can feel disheartening and very frustrating, but I want to echo what was said, that part of the reason why we've made this significant progress recently is because of that grassroots work of folks who've been doing this work in Winchester and in our communities for years now.
So all those letters and phone calls actually make a difference?
It works.
Both that and the work that's actually done at the local level to implement sustainable programs, because when those actions get taken, whether it's in a neighborhood, in a town, in a city, it's like a pebble in a pond, and the ripples out from there. Same thing when we do something at the state level, it ripples out to other states and so on. So that has a big impact too.
Great, thank you. So before I ask the next question, if you have already written down some questions on your index cards, catch Tatiana's attention, just hold up the card. She's going to collect from you as I ask, and then they answer this next question. Bring the cards to me so that I can start to organize which questions that we're going to actually ask and get answered here tonight. So Tatiana's ready to take your cards as soon as you're ready. So this next question is, what important climate and sustainability bills do you expect to see next session, and which ones do you plan to champion in one way or another, as a chair, as a sponsor, co-sponsor, or in some other way? And who wants to start first?
Go reverse order?
Sure.
That's always a trick question at this stage of the game, since we're all working on the bills now, preparing for next session. And it's really difficult to determine what will emerge. And one of the things that I always tell people is we have at least 6,500 bills a session. And at the beginning of the session, there's a series of very small bills that often get combined into much larger bills. So asking us now what we're going to support before those bills have been filed or before they've been gone through the hearing process and released improved versions and brought to the floor is a little bit difficult. Some of the things that we hope we'll see, I talked a little bit about them just a moment ago with the zero waste items, since that's really something that the legislature hasn't taken up in quite a while, the waste-related bills. And I do believe that there's an appetite. We know that many communities, for instance, have plastic bag bans. We're getting to a point where a critical mass of individual cities and towns have already passed those, and as well as bans on things like plastic water bottles, single-use items. And so I think there's going to be some movement to do some portion or hopefully a large portion of the plastics omnibus bill that we worked on, Senator Lewis and I together. And we're going to have to continue to figure out how to put enough resources into the programs that will make a difference to transform, our energy systems and our individual buildings. And so I think funding will be something that we're going to look at more closely, finding ways to ensure that there's adequate resources. And I think that when you ask me what I would support, just about anything related to the environment and climate that can have a positive impact, I'm going to be behind. I try to take seriously the advocacy community's priorities when I hear from different organizations and when I hear from constituents, to make sure I'm keeping an open mind and capturing as many things as possible. One of my favorite small bills that relates to the environment will be, that I will refile, is a green landscaping bill. So in Lexington, we've now passed a bylaw outlawing the blowers that goes into effect in a couple of years and requiring electric leaf blowers. And there's a number of communities, Arlington just did the same. And there's a number of communities that are concerned with the noise as well as the toxic chemicals that come out of two-stroke motors. They're far worse than larger motors. And in fact, they don't have things like our cars have, like catalytic converters, which actually filter and clean some portion of the emissions. So the toxic chemicals are really bad for the workers that are handling this equipment, and they're bad for our environment in our neighborhoods. But my concern has always been that if we go to this transition, we want to find ways to support the landscapers themselves so it's not a burden on them. And so I had a bill that would have done two things, and I'm going to be refiling it. Essentially helps cities and towns convert their equipment to electric landscape equipment, and then gives zero-interest loans to small business owners to purchase the equipment. And taking it further, I think next session I will try to convert that into a grant program instead of a loan program, and find a source of revenue to support it, because we want to make sure that our small businesses are supported in the transition so that it will help their workers and their businesses, et cetera. So I will stop there. And
I think to Michelle's point, the beginning of the term, I always look at as an opportunity to file these really targeted, specific pieces of legislation and get them in a position that they can be tacked on to what ends up moving, right? So the initial bill, the omnibus bill, whatever you're going to look at, is going to change dramatically over the course of the term. And my strategy has always been, let's get some bills out there so that we have the conversation, and then we can attach them as that vehicle starts moving. For me, Michelle had referenced earlier the extended producer responsibility piece of legislation that I've been working on. That's relating to the packaging industry. Right? We've all dealt with, especially during the pandemic, you get that package at your front door. It's this giant box from Amazon. You open it up, there's another box inside. It's like a Russian nesting doll to get at this thing, and you're getting a USB drive at the end of it after you get this giant box. The proposal would be to make sure that those people, those companies that are putting these packaging into our system have a little stake in the game after it enters our system. And it'd be a carrot and a stick approach, right? So if you put in more recyclable material on your packaging, you're not going to pay as much of a fee as if you're putting in non-recyclable materials. And there would be a sustainable advisory board, recyclable advisory board, set up to manage this type of system under the auspices of the DEP, but separate. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds on that, but essentially that's the model. And whatever fees are thrown off then get returned directly to the cities and towns who are absorbing much higher waste disposal costs. And the taxpayers, as we are paying more for, as Michelle talked about, the dirty recycling as well as the pure waste that we have to deal with. And so we had made some significant progress on that bill this term, and it was due in large part, I think, not only to the advocacy of environmental groups and individuals, but also the awareness from municipalities that said, this makes sense for us. Never mind the environment. They're looking at it from a dollars and cents position. And so we were able to marry these two groups that are usually at each other's throats, Mass Municipal Association and environmental groups, to come together to support that piece of legislation and get it out of the committee for the first time and near the finish line. We're hopeful that that'll be pushed over the top as we work with our colleagues in the Senate as well on that piece. And then the last one I'll talk about just very briefly, it's very straightforward. I think it's a one-paragraph bill. We're all hearing about the dawn of autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles. My legislation says if you're going to have an autonomous vehicle, it's got to be electric. Pretty straightforward. You've got a new industry coming out. Let's get it right off the hop and make sure that if you are creating these new technologies, these new vehicles, they are environmentally sustainable vehicles. So they're electric vehicles. We were at one of the caucus meetings on this autonomous vehicle piece, a study group that came through 2 terms ago, I believe it was, when I first filed it. And everyone got up and talked about how long, what their bill did. And I just stood up and I said, if it's autonomous, it's electric. Thanks. Sat down. So pretty straightforward and targeted bill. But those are the types of initiatives I think you'll start seeing a lot more of as well from all corners of the legislature, which I think is very encouraging.
Great, a lot of great stuff. I'm really looking forward to working with my colleagues on all these initiatives. I'll just quickly mention 3 things. First is echoing again, we have to tackle solid waste, particularly single-use plastics. We are just drowning in them. It's destroying our ecosystems. The impact on our marine ecosystems is just devastating. Most of this stuff, the plastics, is not being recycled. It was true even before we were shipping it off to China. It's even more true now. We've got to get serious about it. California is doing great things in this space. Some other states, Massachusetts needs to get our act together. So definitely hoping to do a major solid waste reduction bill that updates the bottle bill, implements EPR just like Maine has done recently, and and really tackles single-use plastics, not just plastic bags, but other types as well. So that's definitely high on my list. Another area I've been working on is, I mentioned the Green Communities program, which Winchester was an early adopter of. About 80% of communities are now green communities. We're going to hopefully get that all the way up with what I talked about before by helping communities served by municipal light plants. So I want to think about now is what's the next generation of the Green Communities program, like the Green Communities Plus. And I've been talking to MAPC for a while about that. What could we require? What sort of additional incentives could we provide? How could we help the Winchesters of the world to take it to another level? And then the last thing I'll mention, which I know is going to make Susan McPhee happy, I do serve as the chair of the Education Committee. And as Rep. Day said, we're thinking about climate in everything we do. Well, one of the areas within education is how do we make sure we have green and healthy schools, facilities for all of our students. And that's particularly true when we're building new schools or renovating them. So how do we get the state school building program, the MSBA, to take climate change seriously and have a world-class program, right? That will lead to school buildings, which like Winchester High School, I think is the most significant energy consumer in the town, right? And although that's a pretty energy efficient building, but those should be the kinds of structures that are absolutely greenest, cleanest buildings for a variety of reasons, of course, not the least of which is our children spend so much of their time there.
Great, thanks to all of you. So we're now turning to the audience questions. I'm going to combine these two and then ask it in a slightly different way because it's the kind of question that you could spend an entire evening answering. So one of the questioners asked, how serious is our climate challenge? Some say humans are clever and will fix it. Others anticipate accelerating extinctions, human conflicts, hunger, and suffering. Where do you stand? That's the first question, which I'm going to combine with. As we leave this evening, how do you want us to describe this new climate legislation to friends and neighbors in 30 seconds? What's the elevator pitch? And so in other words, and these are questions actually, the first one is one that I get a surprising amount of the time. People essentially ask me versions of, are we doomed? Is there any hope? Are we going to solve the climate crisis, or are we essentially just doomed? And so you've now said that the legislature is looking at every bill as a climate bill. There's new energy, new leadership, that activists are making a real impact. Where are we headed? And what do you think the legislature's role is going to be in this in 30 seconds? Whoever wants
I'll
to
go
jump
first.
in.
I mean, I honestly, I appreciate the question, but I don't think I have, or we have more insight sort of into that than folks out here in the audience do. I mean, I wouldn't do the work that we do if I wasn't an eternal optimist. I know most of you wouldn't do the work that you do, right, if you weren't optimists. So it doesn't mean we have rose-colored glasses. I mean, yes, we know that the impact of climate change is terrifying, and it's real, and probably no matter what we do to transition to clean renewable energy, we're still going to have terrible impacts in terms of sea level rise and extreme weather events, and that's going to be worse. But what I do know is if we get our act together, we can prevent the worst of that from happening. So it'll be less bad in years to come, particularly in more vulnerable places. And also, by taking the actions to make our communities more resilient, we will be able to better withstand and better manage, these changes in our climate in the future. So I certainly don't see any reason to just give up and say we're doomed. There's nothing we can do. But that doesn't mean that this isn't very challenging and difficult work.
I think you're not in this room if you don't think we've got a climate crisis or an emergency on our hands. The thing that, I guess back to the pitch, Ken, it's a step forward. It's a meaningful step forward. We're not going to turn the battleship around overnight. We're not going to be able to reform individuals' behaviors, societal behaviors overnight. This is a meaningful step forward to starting to make that turn. Jason had referenced the severe storms. We're getting a storm of the century every other week. And this was predictable. This is what science tells us is coming. And it's going to continue to come. And until we start taking steps like these last two omnibus bills in Massachusetts, we're not going to be able to start really meaningfully address it. It's not going to be, certainly I don't think within my lifetime, that we're going to solve this. But if we don't start the work, where are we? It's been kicked down the road by our predecessors too often. Now, as I said, I wasn't being facetious, every bill is a climate bill. We're dealing, again, in judiciary, as Jason is on the education side, we've got to rebuild our prisons, modernize our courthouses. All of that's going to be done through the green glasses as we're doing that, for lack of a better, I got caught in the rose-colored glasses analogy. But that's what we're looking at. Every building, every type of infrastructure improvement we're making is now focused on resiliency and combating the damages of not paying attention to climate control.
So I'm going to echo what Senator Lewis said about being an optimist. We couldn't do this work unless we believed that we could have a positive impact. But climate change is an existential threat to human life on this earth. So we can't take it more seriously. We have to really dig in. But I also think we can't expect all the change to happen by individuals. We need large policy changes, and that will drive the behavioral change. And so sometimes I think we get caught up in the anxiety of trying to reform our individual behavior, and it can be almost debilitating for some folks, right? They get overwhelmed by it. And so I think when we talk about the legislation, I think it's really important to talk about it as visionary and not just a step forward, but Massachusetts playing a leadership role. But we also have to say yes, and we can do more, and we must do more. So framing it in a positive light, because that will help other people want to come along for the journey and participate. Nobody wants to be chastised and told that, we're not doing enough and this is all awful, and you go home and you think, might as well just give up. So we really need to keep people engaged in a very positive way. But we're also going to have to make some hard sacrifices. There's going to be costs associated with some of the things that have to change. And, in order to change, for instance, transportation behavior, to actually incentivize people to get out of their cars more, that's not easy work. And there'll be times when we're going to have to call on the public to support, really massive changes in the system. And if we don't do that, then we aren't going to meet our targets on the transportation side. So I think about that a lot because that's an area where I have a lot of experience and background, and I just want to remind people that there's plenty of work yet to do, and we need all of your help in advancing some of that work.
Great, thank you. So next two questions I'm going to combine have to do with efforts to allow communities to be able to restrict fossil fuels in new construction. So the 2021 bill called on the Department of Energy Resources to create a net zero stretch code. They just released the stretch code as technically a specialized stretch energy code on Friday. It's not net zero. Advocates pushed very hard for that, didn't quite get there. There are going to be major improvements from the bill for communities who adopt it, which Winchester will have the option to do after December, if it so chooses. In addition to that, there was a major push to allow essentially any community who wanted to adopt a net zero for new construction bylaw to allow them to do that. What we ended up with in the 2022 bill was this 10 community pilot. Again, advocates and many within the legislature pushed really hard to go further. So the question really has to do with where are we headed with, there's clearly a lot of pushback from a variety of interests on allowing communities to phase out gas and prevent it for new construction. What are the prospects for giving communities that ability, if they so choose locally, going forward?
I guess I'll jump in on this one since I've been involved quite a bit. There's still interest in coming up with a solution that would be a statewide solution, at least as I understand it from Chairman Roy and others that were involved in the negotiations for this bill. There was great reluctance on the part of the administration to approve anything that included any kind of all-electric requirement for new construction. And so that was one of the reasons why it got dialed back into a 10-community pilot. There's also the requirement in the 10-community pilot for a community to be at 10% affordable housing, because the reluctance was in part a concern that communities wouldn't build any more housing, in particular affordable housing, if it was too expensive to build it because of the all-electric requirements in these bylaws that were being proposed. So for communities that want to move forward, they do have to have 10% affordable housing on their subsidized housing index. I think that my understanding from leadership in the House was that there was a preference to have a system that would be the same for all communities instead of these 10 pilots and separate bylaws, and that I think that is still the belief that we would be better off if we can come up with something that would be universal for all cities and towns. So I think that's what the legislature will keep pushing for, and with the changes in administration, there is much more hope that we might get something to move forward. But the unions were very much against this in some cases, especially the pipe fitters unions and certain unions that thought that construction would be hurt by converting to all-electric buildings. And we have to figure out what we're going to do about the changes that will benefit some and hurt other groups of workers. And so there is interest, for instance, in trying to see what there's some pilots for geothermal distributed underground through pipes that might be used as community-based projects where multiple buildings can be served by the same treatment facility, and that would allow for potentially another avenue for pipe fitters to have work underground going forward if those types of systems could be viable, and that we're starting to test them. I think National Grid has got a pilot, but don't quote me on that. But one of the utilities is actually testing this, and it's an interesting prospect to help give the union something to do if we start to phase out pipes that are used for natural gas. So I think we will see it picked up again because there are so many communities pushing for it, and now that Boston jumped in, Worcester just had a conversation about it. They decided not to go forward initially, but there was great disappointment on the part of the residents that Worcester was not going to try to be one of the 10 communities. At least that's what I saw in the most recent newspaper report. So when you see the big cities going for it, you know that this is ripe for revisiting.
Look, touching back on Michelle and Jason's optimism, I think this is a huge development that we got the 10-city pilot in there. It's a crack in the door, right? It's been opened up now, and you're going to have a proof of concept essentially from these 10 cities and towns that show that it works, and you can address concerns from some of the different groups that are against us for, you know, the kind of narrow reason, and that's what their job is protect their members. But that narrow reason, you're going to be able to address and say, hey, this isn't going to harm your industry. We're going to be able to work with you and get that through. But overcoming that threat from the administration at the end of our session, that if this gets in, the bill's going to get not going to go anywhere. To be able to get this pilot program in, I think, is a huge step forward. I think back, during COVID, we necessarily had to move to different things, and we've seen that they work. Outdoor seating, terrific. For the 5 months we can actually enjoy the outside in New England, it's going to be permanent, right, for our restaurants. Telemedicine was an issue that I've been working on a lot, and we had real reservations from members of the legislature to implementing it. We had to go to telemedicine during the pandemic, and it worked. And so now telemedicine is going to be a permanent feature in our healthcare system, which I think is a huge step forward. Same as this. Once we get this up and moving, I think it's going to become evident to everyone, well, yeah, that's where we're going. So I think it's a meaningful step forward. I'm very optimistic about the fact that it got through and that the governor eventually relented and signed it as was. And we're going to be able to move forward and keep kicking that door open down the road.
The only thing I would add to those excellent comments is that this helps point to the interconnectedness of different challenges that are facing us, because when we're working on environmental policy, climate policy, it also has ramifications for health and public health. It also, in this case, potentially has ramifications for housing. Right? We do undeniably have an affordable housing crisis in the greater Boston region as well. So, obviously transportation is very interconnected. So these linkages and interconnections are something that I think the environmental community in the past was less focused on when thinking about environmental policies, just very strictly through that lens. And I think that has changed, rightly so, over time. And I talked about environmental justice before and how that's much more part of the understanding. And I think that's really important and helpful, that as we pursue environmental policies, including our climate work, that we are thoughtful about the connections to transportation, to housing, to health, and how they fit together, and how we make sure in this work we don't leave vulnerable people behind.
Thank you. So just a quick time check. It's 8:03. We advertised this as ending at 8, but there's a lot of great questions here. Are we okay going to maybe 8:15? Is that okay with you? Great, thank you. So this was a question. I think I'll more just make it a request and then go to the next question. Someone wrote that the DPU, Department of Public Utilities, has become a major roadblock for much progress on energy. Is the legislature tackling this? And an example would be something that I know Senator Lewis and Rep. Day, we worked with you on, having to do with Winchester's municipal green aggregation program, wind power, and the rigid rules that the DPU applies, the long delays in getting an answer, and the fact that we're essentially treated as a predatory, competitive electricity supplier anytime we want to communicate with the public. And so the DPU has just been very unfriendly to work with, very unresponsive. Rather than sort of asking, are you taking that on? I know that it is an issue, and I would simply state, please keep working with us. Please make this a priority. Those communities that have green municipal aggregations should absolutely not be treated the same as the predatory suppliers out there.
Can I quickly add something on that? Because we actually did take included provisions in we ended up doing it through the state budget back in July to address the lengthy delays in the DPU and getting approvals to municipal aggregation programs. And unfortunately, the governor sent that back. That's why it's not law right now. It's pending back before the legislature because Governor Baker sent it back. And my response would be the best way we can improve the operations of DPU and DOER and our other agencies that are sometimes not as aggressive and as bold as they should be is elect a new governor who's going to make this a priority.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think you're going to see significant interest from the legislature into the operations and the way that DPU is managed. And to Senator Lewis's point, with the change of administration, I think you're going to see significant improvements to DEP, DOER, all the alphabet soup that we're talking about with the oversight groups there.
Yep.
Okay, that's quite hopeful. Thank you. See, it's Climate Solutions Week. We have solutions coming. That's great. So both the state's climate plans as well as Winchester's and many other communities rely on the hierarchy of make everything efficient, electrify everything, and then supply all of that electricity from green sources. One questioner asks, as we do that, and we greatly increase the electricity demand for all of these cars, buildings, et cetera, will the grid be able to handle that? And will we actually have green power to go into that grid? Whoever wants to go first.
So I'd just say, as part of the bill that we just passed into law, we've got the grid readiness language in there, seeing that, so proactively taking, understanding that's coming down the road, modernizing that grid, modernizing our energy storage infrastructure as well, which is going to be hugely important as we move to recyclable, renewable energies. So I think that, the proactive steps in that piece with respect to the grid readiness is a huge step forward for us, and it's certainly something we're going to continue to work to improve as our renewable portfolio grows.
I'll just add to that we also will need to do as much energy conservation as we can. So making sure your homes are weather tight and reducing your own consumption can be helpful as we transition the grid. Once the grid is fully transitioned and modernized, then it'll be less of an issue, but we do need to be careful in these initial years.
And to Rep. Scolo's point there, that the bill also includes some updates and enhancements to the Mass Save program. So that's another way to help homeowners, business owners to make those energy upgrades, efficiency upgrades.
And on that, just to jump on the Mass Save piece too, the bill limits what Mass Save can be put towards with respect to fossil fuels. So you're going to get the Mass Save assistance if you're moving towards more energy efficient, less fossil fuel dependent appliances.
Yeah, we ought not to be incentivizing gas and oil any further, so that is a
Yes.
big improvement. Rep. Sicolo, a question that was posed directly to you. How can residents of Winchester best support your House Bill 868 incentive funding to transition landscaping fleets?
Great question. I think
Did you write that?
I think doing what you can locally to raise awareness of the issue, and then being active when the hearing process comes and writing in and writing to all of us and to leadership in the House and Senate, those things are helpful. I think one of the things for that bill that will be a challenge will be getting the next administration interested in it, and I would expect that the next administration will be looking for innovative things to do, but we in the legislature can't just create a program and ask the administration to do it. They have to have the bandwidth and the desire to also drive it forward. So my strategy will be a little bit different this session, and I hope to work more closely with the governor's administration to have them adopt the concept and move it forward.
Another way we can support Rep. Scolo's bill is by adopting this in Winchester, right? This is going to be.
I didn't want to go that far since I'm new here, but
I'll go
I'll
there.
let you say it.
I'll go there. This is going to be before town meeting, right, in November, modeled after Lexington's policy. So if Winchester were to adopt this, that's one more community. That analogy I used before of the ripple, the stone in the pond and the ripples out. A lot of the policies we pass at the state level, this is true a lot in environmental and also public health, is because they started in an individual city or town, and then they spread from there, and then you reach a critical mass where we are able to pass it at the state level.
Great. Okay, next question. Residential buildings generate a lot of greenhouse gases. Is there action to rate residential buildings like we rate appliances for their energy use and emissions?
Yeah, obviously there's been proposals on that end. I think you're going to get opposition. We've heard opposition from realtors and other groups.
Yep.
And I think a lot of this is, from my perspective, educating those groups as to what it is and what it isn't. And there's going to be some different approaches, I think. Again, I always go back to the carrot and stick analogy of that. You're going to have a market moving forward, I think we already do, of individuals who want to know that information about the properties they're interested in purchasing. And so the market will drive a lot of this if the legislature isn't able to get out in front of it itself.
For a number of years when I was involved in the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, there was a bill that specifically had the property being assessed or rated at the point of sale, because that is the time when people are most motivated to make changes to their property. So it's not common where you just decide you're going to move out of your house for a month or move all your things into a couple of rooms and go through and retrofit your home. That's a very difficult thing to do while you're living in it. So there really is an opportunity when the property changes hands. And that's really important that we get something done, marshaling all the resources that we have through the Mass Save program and other programs, and working more collaboratively with the realtors, with the home sellers, so that they have the resources they need to feel confident in updating their property before they sell it, or in identifying what needs to be done so that the buyer can do it. And it would be immensely helpful to get legislation on that front passed, and it's something that I'll look at this upcoming session.
Great. So this question is, who, if anyone, does the analysis of how our climate actions impact the mass economy? I suspect they have a positive effect, and if so, can we get the word out to other regions of the country? So you've been talking about how every bill is a climate bill now. I think there has been a sea change in society in general in favor of taking action on climate change. How does the legislature incorporate analysis of of economic impacts as you work on these on climate legislation?
I mean, I would say not unique to this area, but when we're working on legislation, whether, I'm working on education policy as chair of the Education Committee, or Rep. Dave, you're working on a judiciary bill, we want to make sure we're considering the best possible research and evidence and best practices. So, some of that work might be done within the legislature, although most of it is going to be done by academic experts, by organizations, think tanks and research organizations that do specialize in that area. Some of it is done by the administration, so in this case the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. So we just try to make sure we're looking to get the, certainly in Massachusetts, but even in other parts of the country, wherever that best, most current research and best practices are available, so we can incorporate that into our policy work.
Yeah, I think with respect to everything economically, they're based on models and forecasts and a crapshoot at the end of the day, putting your faith in some of the research and some of the studies that are out there. Michelle had referenced earlier the wind piece. One of the major selling points for that, across, to Jason's point, the bipartisan nature of support it got, was the models and the forecasts all point to Massachusetts' economy being rock solid, because this is the next area of development in economic development. This is going to produce jobs for individuals who may not have higher education, very well-paying jobs for a long period of time, both in the construction and the operations of our wind industry. That's all based on forecasted models and faith in those models. So to the economic driver point, Massachusetts pushed in on that. And I think the rest of the country is looking at it and saying, California certainly has been neck and neck with us on wind, but they're looking at it and saying, all right, well, there's a new field to explore in economic development.
Great. So here's a very specific question, which you may or may not know the answer to. It's more of a request. Can the state please codify signage requirements for electric vehicle charging? We're installing chargers and they're invisible to folks driving by. I don't know if anyone wants to jump on that.
There's a lot of things the state needs to do around EVs.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I keep asking for is an assessment of peak demand on holiday weekends in terms of our turnpike and major highways. Because I fear that if we don't do the analysis for that and cite enough of them, that we'll have people stranded on those holiday weekends while people are still early adopters, and that will set us back. But certainly the folks at MassDOT that are looking at these rollout plans for the EV stations, we can ask them to improve the signage. A lot of the charging stations are found by people through their smartphone apps. That's the way I know most people. We have an all-electric, and you pick up the app and it tells you where there's one that's available and whether or not people are there charging at it, and whether it's busy or not. And you use that to find your charging station. Most people are doing that. But certainly better signage is always good.
Yeah, I'm, again, we sound like, beating dead horses up here, but I'm cautiously optimistic with the new administration coming in that it's not going to be as heavy a lift to get a green sign on the highway next to the blue gas sign, right? Just simple things like that.
Right.
Directing individuals who may not have the apps up on their phones.
Right.
Where is the charging
Well,
station?
and make sure that the charging stations actually aren't broken.
Right.
That they
I
work.
can handle that. I'll do the signage.
Great, well, we are at 8:15. I want to thank, could have been here all night with more questions. I want to thank our panelists for a great evening and for spending time with us tonight, and for your leadership in the House and Senate on climate and environmental issues. We're lucky to have you representing us. And I want to thank everyone for coming, and don't forget to attend the remaining events in Climate Solutions Week running through this Sunday. A lot of great activities, and you can see it on the list. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you all.